There are multiple threats. The big threat is climate change, but we'll start at the more specific threats. The specific threats would be urban development. So when Lancaster and Palmdale developed, they took out thousands of Joshua trees. When Yucca Valley started developing, they took out a lot of Joshua trees. And so that's sort of the more finite, on a microscopic level, what are the threats. The larger threats really are from two different sources, both of which are due to people. One of which is as Los Angeles has developed and cars have been the main mode of moving from point A to point B in Los Angeles, smog has been the result of that. And smog, everybody who lives in Los Angeles is familiar with smog. What they're not familiar with is that all that smog blows into the Mojave Desert. The second big one, and the one that is really on a lot of people's minds right now, is climate change. Joshua trees are adapted to the Mojave Desert. They're incredibly well adapted to the Mojave Desert, but they don't occur in the drier, hotter Colorado Desert, which is immediately south of it. And the reason they don't is that they need the cooler, wetter conditions for their seedlings to be able to survive and become adults. What's happening with climate change is the climate of the Mojave Desert is shifting to be closer to that hotter, drier Colorado Desert, and so it's no longer supporting conditions that allow the young Joshua trees to get established. So what we're seeing is at lower elevations and at elevations or places that are not getting a lot of rain, and especially south-facing areas. Even if you see adult Joshua trees, that just meant that the conditions were good 100 years ago, or maybe 200 years ago, but you don't see any baby Joshua trees. The seedlings are not coming in. And that's happening over a huge area of the extent of Joshua trees. There are areas within the Mojave Desert where they're still doing fine, and we have called those climate refugia. But there are much larger areas that they're not doing fine.
My name is David Smith, and I'm the Park Superintendent for Joshua National Park. This is a beloved park for Southern Californians. We kind of think of this as Southern California's national park. From folks that are coming from Los Angeles or San Diego, this is a place that everyone grew up going to for camping. It's also really beloved by European visitors as well. And I think a lot of it has to do with the iconic nature of the Joshua tree. Climate change is the biggest threat to Joshua trees. Climate scientists will tell you that we're going to see less recruitment of Joshua tree species at their kind of fringe areas. So in places where it's too hot to induce budding in the plants, where there's just not enough soil moisture for nurse plants to continue to exist. For example, plants like blackbrush and the more woody plants like Phaedra or Mormon tea, where a baby Joshua tree can get its start and be protected from herbivores. We're just not seeing quite as much of that. I have noticed just personally that at lower elevations in the park, where they used to see a lot more diversity of Joshua trees, young, juvenile, and adult, now you just typically don't see that diversity. You see, adolescent and adult trees predominantly as you're making your way up, for example, from 29 Palms and you're climbing up in elevation to about that 3,000 foot. You don't really see, sizable forests with the diversity of age brackets until you get to about 3,300, 3,500 feet in elevation. I see one of my jobs as park superintendent is ensuring that this Joshua tree species continues to exist so that a century from now, when we really do have carbon sequestration, under control, and we are on the other side of this, we still have a healthy population of trees protected in the 4 million acres of national parks we have in the Mojave. I had a really forward-thinking botanist who was on our staff, and he was like, we are going to lose our Joshua tree populations if we look at the projections for the next, 80 years. Fire will continue to eradicate Joshua trees regardless of global climate change. Fire is going to beat us to it. So, we've got to be way more proactive in trying to create the infrastructure that will protect the trees. Once fire goes through an area, that biomass, those decomposing needles from pinions and from grass species and things like that, wash away or they blow away, and you're left with this sterile, defoliated granite, which is really tough for things to grow in. And since you don't have the seed plants, since you don't have the nurse plants, you don't have Joshua trees coming back in those areas. So, and this is a new phenomena in the Mojave Desert. Fire typically has not been a big portion of our history. It was limited in times past before cattle ranching came to this area to a lightning strike during the monsoon season would burn down a Joshua tree, and it would fall to the ground, and it would burn the species that are within 20 feet of the tree, and then the fire would be over. But now with the grass being really prolific in the northwestern corner of the park, where we see so much nitrogen deposition taking place because of the smog that comes into the Coachella Valley, it's naturally fertilizing these plants, and it's really changing the history of Joshua tree. I'm constantly amazed at the number of people that come to this park that see the Joshua tree as a symbol of the desert and whatever that means to them. A desert is a place where people, find peace. It's a place where people get away, and the Joshua tree is the symbol. You look through a travel magazine, you watch a television program, and you will see the Joshua tree repeatedly showing up all the time. And I think it's something we can use as a tool right now to move us all along to a place where we can slow down on our carbon consumption, where we can start moving in the other direction, because we don't want to lose that symbol.
Joshua trees are torn down to make way for solar projects. 23 ABC's Cassie Carlisle travels to the Mojave Desert to talk to neighbors.
They're not your usual tree.
Crazy looking cactus.
More like something from fiction, but these Joshuas are causing quite an uproar.
No, it makes me sick. I've seen this. I grew up here, and so have a lot of other people. And we don't know what to do about it. We're outgunned with a billion-dollar company.
The landscape near Rosamond has transformed over the years from desert to solar farms.
They're clearing them off, killing them real quick, and now they're grinding them up, getting rid of all the evidence.
But residents are concerned that more solar projects could come into the area in the future.
There's thousands of other acres out here that have already leveled. They farmed it, they don't farm it. If they had to do it there.
Saying someone has to speak up for the trees.
Hi, my name is Kaiser. I'm the botanist here. Thank you for all coming out. We're really excited to have you all here. We're out here on Sema Dome. The thing that we'll be doing out here is planting Joshua trees because researchers have predicted that Sema Dome will be a climate refugia for the species. However, they did not predict that there would be a massive wildfire here. What we've done is we've used some aerial imagery and some burn severity analysis to kind of show where the hot spots of the fire were and where the really bad burn areas were. And so that's where these planting sites are. At each one of these planting sites, we're going to be planting 6 Joshua trees in 4 different ways. So we're planting about 1,000 trees this year, and we'll be planting another 1,000 each year for the next 3 years on Sema Dome.
My name is Dr. Juniper Herer, and I'm a desert ecologist and an environmental artist. Joshua trees have this really incredible reproductive biology. They have been co-evolving with this little yucca moth for millions of years. And what happens is Joshua trees are in flower, and these little moths rise up out of the soil, and they mate, and then the female yucca moth collects pollen from a flower, and she goes over to one of the yucca blossoms, the Joshua tree blossoms, and she She deposits her eggs inside of the flower. She puts them inside, and then she takes all of this pollen that she has stuffed in these tentacles right here where her mouth would be, and she shoves it into the flower. And so what she's doing is ensuring that as her babies, her developing moth larvae develop inside of that flower, the flower is going to turn into a fruit because she's pollinated it. And then what happens is the flower starts to develop into a Joshua tree fruit, and it's full of seeds, and her developing moth larvae eat a portion of those seeds, and then some of the seeds go on to become the next generation of Joshua trees. It's completely dependent on these moths, right? So without the moths, you don't have seeds, and you don't have the next generation of Joshua trees. I did a study in the national park back in 2015 to look at what was actually happening with Joshua tree populations right now in the park with climate change. So are we seeing new Joshua tree babies? And then also what was happening with our moth pollinators. And I went to some of the hottest, driest locations and then some of the coldest locations. And this gives me an idea of what may change with Joshua tree pollination biology and this relationship with changing climate, because I'm creating a climate gradient through this study and the work that I was doing. In the hottest and driest sites, I was seeing a lot of Joshua tree death and no new baby Joshua trees. And then looking closer, I found that there were no moths around at these really hot and dry locations. And so the Joshua trees were still flowering, but there was no moths to do that pollination. And then the same thing was happening at those really cold locations. And so what this says is that at the hottest spots and the coldest spots, there was no sexual reproduction happening. And this doesn't bode well for changing climate scenarios. So it was still happening in the more moderate temperatures, but not at these extremes. And so when we want to think about, okay, it's getting hotter and drier in some places, and the trees aren't doing well, and there's no sexual reproduction happening, so that's going to be a retreating area of Joshua tree growth. And then you would hope that they're moving up into these colder, wetter areas, but I wasn't seeing that either. So that's also, those kinds of things start to look really concerning when we're looking at the health of the population over time, and if we should be concerned right now, even though they look so widespread and abundant.
When we look at the future of Joshua trees in a situation where humans have chosen not to do anything to curb climate change, to curb greenhouse gas emissions, then probably within 50 to 80 years, there will be a situation within Joshua Tree National Park, and probably within the vast majority of the range, where there is no more reproduction. That it wouldn't necessarily kill them outright, but there would be no more reproduction. And if there's no more reproduction, and this moth that is so important for their reproduction has no longer been able to survive as well, then you have a bunch of standing trees that might live another 100 years or two, and eventually they'll die, and there's nothing to replace them. So the metaphor that I try to get people to think about is, if you were to come to a community and all there was a senior center or a group of senior centers, but no elementary schools, that's a community that eventually will die. It'll go that, and so extinction, in its most abrupt sense, is that the species is gone. But biologically extinct means there's no more reproduction.